It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. As you know, this is the show about all things U of L. We'll be talking about Title IX at the University of Louisville, and also later on in the show, some really cool clips, radio clips from old radio on Wave Radio. And Wave Radio here in Louisville. It's part of a radio archiving project at the University of Louisville and nationwide. So stand by for that, because you'll hear some old radio clips from 1939 and 1943 a little bit later in the show. But first, U of L has a new coordinator for its Title IX and ADA compliance programs. Brian Bigelow is in charge of promoting U of L's policies on sexual discrimination, violence, and education, and ensuring that U of L complies with all federal laws regarding accommodations for employees and students with disabilities. And he's new to Louisville. So welcome, Brian Bigelow.
Thank you, Mark.
Glad you're here. All right. Where'd you come from?
I came most recently from Chicago, where I was working for the last 15 years in on the enforcement side of Title IX and the ADA for the U.S. Department of Education in their Civil Rights Enforcement Division. So I covered a 6-state region, and now I have jumped over to the higher ed internal compliance side.
So you've gone from the guy that was the cop, and now you're the lawyer?
That's one way of putting it, yes.
That's sort of the way of putting it?
That is a good way of putting it, yes.
Well, welcome to Louisville. How long have you been in Louisville?
Thanks,
so
I've
far?
been here since June.
Oh, okay, so you're
started at U of L July 1st.
Okay, living in old Louisville and starting at U of L. Well, what is Title IX? Just explain to people what Title IX is.
Broadly speaking, Title IX is, it's short for Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, and it is the federal statute that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any program or activity run by a college or school that gets federal money. And Title IX and discrimination based on sex encompasses any number of things, although most prominently in the news recently has been the focus on sexual assault on college campuses and schools' responses to that and efforts to prevent it. So that is a significant focus in my new role, although there are other aspects to Title IX compliance, including equity in athletics programs,
right,
which
we
for a long
often
time.
hear about.
Yes,
right.
I'm so old. I remember when people associated Title IX with athletics compliance. It still is associated with that, although the sexual assault issue has, and rightfully so, gotten the lion's share of the ink in recent years.
Right, but Title IX affects the entire campus.
Of course, yes.
And that's your job, right?
Yes, it is.
So what specifics, what do you do on a daily basis? What's your job?
Well, every day is different from another. On the Title IX side, my big picture focus is on overseeing our processes related to receiving sexual assault complaints, investigating them, following up appropriately, providing services, and making sure that survivors have the resources they need, whether on campus or off. In overseeing the process of educating students and staff on their responsibilities under Title IX, and that includes going just beyond the letter of the law. And though it may seem counterintuitive coming from a person who has been in the law enforcement area and who's an attorney, but I think for the moment, I think we want to ignore what the letter of the law says in terms of stopping there and going beyond what the law requires. I think it goes beyond.
So you need to go above and beyond.
It goes, yeah. I think it's
moral
really,
authority, that kind of thing.
Right. The focus is less on. Obviously, legal compliance is critical, but really, what we're focusing on in the big picture is what kind of campus we want to have. Do we have a safe, inclusive community? Is this the kind of place where you want to go to school, where you want to send your daughters and sons? And a lot of that is tied into our bystander training programs, which are aimed at shifting cultural norms that over time have tended to give rise to increased incidents of sexual assault.
That you stand by and watch something happen and don't report it, or don't.
Yeah, or simply where I guess underlying dynamics like tolerance of chauvinistic, sexist behavior, tolerance of the sort of alcohol-fueled culture where lines of consent are often blurred or ignored or minimized in importance. All of that, I think, is something that we can improve upon as campuses. I think U of L, I think, has done largely a good job of addressing those issues, but there's always more that we can do. There are always more people that we can reach, and it's naive to think that we can completely eliminate this problem, but we can always, I think, do a better job of fostering an environment where it is not tolerated and where, when it does occur, our response is effective, swift, and comprehensive.
What do you tell students? I mean, you've just come to this side, and U of L, I think, from my view at least, has a pretty good program for an education program for students about reporting these things and alcohol education, those kinds of things.
Right.
But what do you tell students, especially the incoming freshmen, about here's what our standards are at the University of Louisville regarding sexual discrimination, sexual assault, reporting it, those kinds of things? What do you tell students?
Well, my office partners very heavily with the Peace program at U of L, which is to a great extent sort of the humanistic, soft, practical side of the Title IX issue, in that it presents to students in real-life terms role-playing scenarios, real-life situations where these sort of cultural norms that I've talked about tend to manifest themselves. Whether it's at a party with people you don't know, where you don't know who's serving you what, where you may not have a safety plan to get out if something goes astray.
Bad, yeah.
We try to focus on practical realities because I don't think it's an effective means to reach, especially the student population, with a bland PowerPoint that recites the verbiage of what Title IX says under the regs. I think really what matters and what brings it to life and what actually puts it into effect on a college campus is communicating what that means on a day-to-day basis, how that affects students, and how they play a role in shifting those cultural norms and in ensuring the university's compliance bit by bit.
You come from the enforcement side of Title IX, and we often hear about the statistics saying, we're only hearing about maybe 1 in 5 or 6 of the sexual assaults that happen on a college campus. Do you think that's an accurate number? What do you think is really happening on college campuses?
Is your question, Mark, the frequency with which sexual assault occurs or with which it's reported? Because
both.
Okay.
Both. Occurs. We know when it's reported.
Right.
But what we don't know is actually how much it's occurring, and then I want to ask you some questions about once it is reported, what happens.
That is a very difficult question to answer simply because historically sexual assault has been underreported. Right. And there have been a number of reasons for that. I think in the past, colleges have not emphasized their infrastructure for responding to Title IX sexual assault reports. They may not have had a comprehensive response, for instance, limiting a response to discipline of a perpetrator. Now, that's often a necessary component of an effective response, but it's not usually sufficient because really what Title IX focuses upon is whether or not a person is subjected to a hostile educational environment. And you don't alleviate that simply by disciplining the perpetrator. You have to provide support to the survivor. You have to make that person aware of what resources are there. You have to follow up to ensure that the same situation doesn't recur. And if you have places on campus or repeat offenders or specific programs that are especially problematic, you need to focus your efforts on those and redouble those efforts. So it's hard to say the frequency with which sexual assault occurs. We can say too often. And certainly the commonly mentioned statistic is 1 in 4. I'm willing to accept the truth of that for purposes of motivating our efforts, because certainly that is way too high. 1 is too many, but that's something we can aspire to. And I think that we've seen an uptick in most campuses that have focused efforts on Title IX compliance, including through hiring of full-time coordinators, beefing up their investigative procedures and investigative staff, and their bystander and Title IX education efforts. We have seen an uptick in complaints at colleges. Now, I don't see that as a sign of things getting worse. I see that as a sign of many colleges finally doing things right. And I think that's
students being willing to come forward.
That is correct. Yes, I think because a crucial point is the students' trust in the processes schools have in place for dealing with sexual assault. If they don't trust them, they will not report. So I would definitely look askance at any report from a college that says we had no sexual assaults on campus this year. That is unlikely to be the case, and it suggests that you are lacking in publicizing your efforts to enforce Title IX, to provide resources to students, and to foster trust in your processes among your student body.
Well, I know at U of L we say the reported cases because that's totally different. Sure. There are some women who walk in and men who walk in for counseling but do not want to go to the police, and,
sure.
and that's their choice. one other thing that I want to talk about for the parents out there. You said generally you think U of L is doing a pretty good job on this. There is two different investigations. When someone walks in, correct? Walks into the peace office at U of L and says, I've been sexually assaulted. It's a two-pronged investigation, right? University and potentially the police, right?
Okay, well, just to to clarify as to the peace office specifically, peace are confidential sources for reporting. So,
it's a counseling service.
Yes, although in other words, reports made to the Peace Center are confidential. Now, if a student reports an assault to a responsible employee for purposes who has a mandatory reporting obligation.
Would that be me?
Policy,
since I'm an employee of UofL?
You'd be a tough call. What
sorry,
policy?
I got you off track. Go back. Go answer my original question.
Yes, you would potentially be. Peace would be confidential, but if somebody comes to a responsible employee who has a responsibility to report the fact of an assault to the Title IX coordinator's office, they would have the option of proceeding or not through a student code of conduct hearing. They would also have the option of reporting to law enforcement, and we always notify students of their various options, and we emphasize that they're not required to pursue any one option, or they can pursue more than one. So often it is the case that a sexual assault will be investigated both by law enforcement, whether it's by Metro Police or ULPD, and the Title IX enforcement staff at the university. And what I think is important to emphasize is that, and this is important because it has been called into question whether colleges should be in the business of investigating sexual assaults. And my response to that is when a Title IX coordinator or an investigator is looking at a sexual assault, at the same time that law enforcement is investigating that same assault, they are looking conceptually at two different things. The police are looking at whether or not there is sufficient evidence to show that a crime under Kentucky law has been committed and can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. From our perspective, we may be looking at whether at the same assault, the same underlying facts, but we are looking at it in terms of whether or not a hostile educational environment has been created for the student affected. And, in fact, whether it affects other students potentially.
Right.
So we are looking at that from that perspective, and the standard of proof is different, of course. It's preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not, as opposed to beyond a reasonable doubt, which is 98, 99%.
Right.
So while the same underlying facts can guide both of our investigations, both
Looking
are
at
essential.
two different things.
Yeah, and both are essential.
Okay. All right. I got to wrap this up real quick. So what would you say about U of L's efforts and what you found so far? I got about 15 seconds.
For the most part, we have a strong infrastructure in place in terms of policy and in terms of enforcement staff. We have in addition to me, there are 3 deputy Title IX coordinators who serve as conduits for complaints depending on who the perpetrator is. We have one for students, student perpetrators, one for employees, one for third parties who are not U of L affiliated. In terms of our educational efforts and outreach efforts, we also have a strong partnership with the Peace Center, also with off-campus entities like the Center for Women and Families that also provide educational efforts. And I think that one of the things that has come up in our climate assessment efforts, which comes out through our annual climate survey, is that we could do a better. We are, I think, doing a good job, but could do a better job of communicating how students report, clearing up any confusion regarding who is and who is not a mandatory reporter, what confidential resources are out there for them should they wish to avail themselves of those resources. So I think the education piece can always be improved upon, but we have a strong foundation to do that.
There's so much more to talk about. We didn't even get into the ADA compliance, Brian. I'm going to have to have you
I
back
could talk
on the
all
show.
day.
Yeah, I'm going to have you back on the show and talk a little more down the road here. But Brian Bigelow, thanks for being on the program, and good luck here at U of L. Christine Eric is an associate history professor at U of L and the communications director for the Radio Preservation Task Force. And wait till you hear a couple of clips that we've got with us. But Christine, first of all, welcome. Welcome to the show.
Glad
you're
here.
here.
Nice to be here.
All right, talk to us about the Radio Preservation Task Force. What are you trying to do?
Well, the Radio Preservation Task Force it's a federal project. It's directed through the National Recording Preservation Board, which is a division of the Library of Congress. Created in 2014, the task force is a kind of coalition of scholars and academics. There's about 200 of us affiliate researchers now and a number of affiliate institutions. And the main goal is really to try and first identify existing, extant, surviving radio archival material and to work to
all across the United States,
all
right?
across the United States. And
so these are old radio shows, old broadcasts that are just
everything.
hanging out there, maybe buried in somebody's desk in an old radio station in Topeka, Kansas,
or
at the University of Louisville or WHAS, wherever.
Right. I just did an
You're
interview.
Trying to find it.
Right. We just did an interview about a librarian in Trenton, New Jersey, who, at the urging of one of my affiliates, who was in charge of the New Jersey territory, went digging and found all kinds of materials, recordings of the Trenton Symphony Orchestra that no one knew existed. So that's part of it. I mean, we're trying to identify what's there and create a kind of national database of what's there. And then, of course, the second task is really to work urgently to preserve these materials because they are at constant and immediate risk of deterioration and loss. Our estimate now is that at least 75% of recorded radio has been lost.
Wow, already?
Either due to deterioration, discarded. We're sort of dealing with a Library of Congress article had referred to the two-headed monster of physical deterioration and technological obsolescence. And so, we're working. The goal is, again, hopefully in the future to be able to marshal resources and funds so that these various the University of Louisville, the Trenton Public Library, whatever it is, can pull together and have resources available to be able to digitize and preserve these materials, and also then make them available to scholars, to ordinary folks, make them available so that people can hear them again.
So what's the University of Louisville's role in all this, and what does a history professor at UofL have to do with all this?
It's a good question. I was approached in late 2014 to join the Radio Preservation Task Force as an affiliate researcher. And that was really because even though I am a Latin Americanist by training, I also am a radio historian. I have a newish book that just came out on women and gender and radio broadcasting in Argentina and Uruguay. So it was a little far. This is a little far from where I had started, but and I have just gotten very involved and interested in the project. It's been kind of exciting at this point in one's career to get to dive into something that's kind of brand new and learn new things about sound archives and preservation and all of that. So a few months ago, they asked me to take over as the communications director. So I'm still learning what all of that means. It involves a lot of outreach to sound archives, nationally and internationally. We are trying to also work to create larger international networks. The British Museum has been very active in this, and we are now partnered up with them, and we are trying to work to create international networks of radio and sound archives around the world so that we can kind of work together on this project that is very much an international scope.
Why do we need to save old radio broadcasts?
It's a great question. I think that, and I'm of course as a radio historian, I'm a little biased about this. Just a little bit. But really, I think if we think of it this way, for 1 to 2 generations of people in the United States and elsewhere in the world, radio was the primary source of mass communication, of mass entertainment. It was a very, very important medium. And if we lose that, especially if we lose the audio, I mean, I'm very interested in thinking about sound and the importance of sound and the human voice. And there is something, as I think you can hear in the clips that I shared with you for today, there's something both intangible and very real about being able to hear the actual sound of these voices speaking, as opposed to what it might have been to just simply read a transcript of the words being spoken. So we feel it's really important to be able to capture and preserve this piece of history. Secondarily, there's a lot of material that, even into the television age, if you want to think about, say politics in the United States, there's a lot of material that went out on the radio that didn't exist, that you wouldn't hear on the television, for example. I mean, radio had space for
Fireside chats,
but then later on, you have,
debates.
You have political, you have kind of radical social justice organizations, you have all kinds of other voices, alternate voices maybe on both the political left and the right that, that you could hear on radio that wasn't around in other places. And so being able to capture those voices and preserve that for future generations, I think, is really important. And it is our responsibility to do it now while we still can.
All right, well, let's listen to one of these that you managed to find. This is from Wave Radio. It's a traffic report, I guess. So tell us a little bit about what we're about to hear.
Kind of, yeah. These come courtesy of the University of Louisville Archives that does have a collection of Wave Radio transcription discs from the...
Old Wave Radio. For folks who don't know,
right.
Wave, the TV station,
Right.
used to be in with Wave Radio, WAVE Radio in Louisville. So here you go.
Right. And so this was a kind of a remote broadcast, sort of experimental for the late 1930s, really a traffic report, but also a kind of meant to be a sort of instructional tour through downtown Louisville in January of 1939, but also, kind of a commentary on traffic safety.
All right, well, let's take a listen. Here you go.
A special safety feature of WAVE. Our shortwave transmitter, W9XSE, in the mobile unit is awaiting to take the signal. At the wheel is Bob Grace, and at the microphone is Officer Jerry Kopp, Superintendent of Traffic Education. In the cause of safety in Louisville, we take you cruising in traffic.
Good evening, my friends. Again, I'd like to have you join me in this great game of traffic as we're going to cruise through Louisville's very busy streets this evening. Before we start cruising, I want to remind you that so far this month, we have had one fatality. However, that counts on last month's record because the person was injured during December and he died before the 15th of this month, counting it on last year's record. And so far this year, really, we have no fatalities. Now, as we're cruising this evening, we're turning to go south onto 4th Street, just turning off of Jefferson Street, and there's not much traffic going south on 4th Street, but quite a number of cars that are coming north on 4th Street, probably all of the line halfway out to Walnut Street as we're pulling up here to Liberty. And here's a pedestrian crossing over through the crosswalk, doing a good job because he is walking with the signal, and now the signal has changed from amber to green, and now the cars are starting to move out on this green light.
That was really interesting. The excitement on the announcer's voice as he's describing this traffic situation in downtown Louisville and Walnut Street, I noticed, which no longer exists, is now Muhammad Ali Boulevard. What did you find interesting about when you heard that clip from 1939 radio in Louisville, Kentucky?
Well, it is interesting. I thought that, the kind of the cadence and the way he's describing these things reminded me of somebody who was announcing a baseball game or something. The kind of excitement of the sportscaster brought to describing the traffic conditions in Louisville, Kentucky, and the hazards of jaywalking and various things. But I also enjoyed, especially if you have the opportunity to listen to the entire recording, which is about 15 minutes. It's not really long. It also gives us, I think, a wonderful kind of word picture of Louisville in 1939. Right, as we're traveling through downtown, and then the vehicle then takes a right turn on Broadway and heads all the way up towards Cave Hill, which is where it kind of ends. And so it's really interesting to hear and to kind of try to imagine in your mind, what this person was seeing and what the streets of the city looked like so many years ago. So it's I think it's a lovely and a really good example of the importance of local radio. This is the other thing that we're trying to get at in terms of preservation. We have, to some extent, some of the national network programming has been preserved and recorded. What we don't have so much of are local programs like this that are both amusing, but I think also historically really important.
Again, we're talking with Christy Narek from the University of Louisville. She's a history professor, and she's also the communications director for the Radio Preservation Task Force, which is a national group that's trying to save all these old radio broadcasts, track them down and save them. All right, well, let's go to clip number 2 here. Why don't you tell us what this clip is, what we're about to hear?
So this clip is from a few years later, from 1943. It is another wave radio broadcast. The UofL Archives, just as on the side, they have about 300 transcription discs of wave radio from the 30s to the 50s. So it's a really great little resource that they're working to digitize and make available. This features host Burt Blackwell, who, for folks who have spent more time in this city than I have, right, was an old sort of long-standing fixture of both wave radio and later wave television. And he is at Bowman Field and with the Glider Pilot Combat Training Unit. This is, of course, during World War II. And this is a remote broadcast from the airport and then later from one of these gliders themselves as they fly over the city.
All right, let's take a listen.
Louisville. Hello, Louisville. You're invited to come for a Sunday afternoon ride by radio in a glider. As their way of saying hello to you in their first radio program from Louisville, the men of the Glider Pilot Combat Training Unit at Bowman Field present a broadcast from a glider in flight over the city. At this moment, an Army glider is poised, ready for the takeoff on a runway out at Bowman Field. And in it is WAVE announcer Bert Blackwell, who will take you with him on a flight over the city. A flight, by the way, which celebrates the first birthday of the 1st Troop Carrier Command, of which the Glider Pilot Combat Training Unit is a part. And now we take you to Bowman Field. Come in, Bert Blackwell.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bert Blackwell speaking from the co-pilot seat in one of the Army Air Force's newest cargo gliders. At my side in the pilot seat and ready to take off and pilot us on the glider run is Major Mike Murphy, Director of Flying Training at the glider unit here and one of the nation's best-known acrobatic flyers. This is another first for Louisville and WAVE in broadcasting this description of the takeoff, maneuvers, gliding, and landing of an Army glider from Bowman Field. On the field, the WAVE mobile unit is stationed to pick up the broadcast from our portable transmitter and relay it to our control rooms downtown.
Live broadcast from Bowman Field from 1941?
43.
1943. So what did you hear in that broadcast that you thought was interesting?
Well, I enjoyed, again, we get a local point of view on a much larger story, of course, a little snapshot of World War II in the city of Louisville. I enjoy the technical aspects of it, a little bit like the earlier cruising and traffic broadcast. We have this kind of remote broadcast technology, which was certainly around at that time, but still something of a novelty, right? And there's a later point in the broadcast where Bert Blackwell is telling listeners that if you're in the Highlands right now, if you look up, you may see us flying overhead, So it's really, you get a sense of the novelty of radio, but also, again, the kind of immediacy and closeness that was there, the intimacy of radio broadcast that we sometimes don't think of when, again, if we focus mostly on these, big national network programs.
Now, both of these clips were from Wave Radio and from the UofL archives, where people can go down, I guess, in the archives and just listen to any of them, right? Can anybody walk in and listen to this stuff at UofL or not?
They are in the process. I've been in communication with both Carrie Daniels and Heather Fox over at the archives, and they are in the process of digitizing some of these materials. It's complicated. The transcription discs, in many cases, it depends on the condition they're in. You have to have the right kind of equipment. Right. In many cases, you only get one play through, and then they're done for. So I know they are in the process of digitizing materials, and so yes, I think some of these materials, that the stuff they have digitized, like what you're hearing today, is available for listening and will continue to become more and more available as time goes on.
And the note, I guess, you'd like to send out, or the plea perhaps that you'd like to send out to maybe radio stations across the Louisville area, is what? If you've got some old stuff,
let me
call
know.
me.
Yeah, let me know. Absolutely. We want to know about it. The task force has a very simple Google form that we're asking anybody who has materials to simply fill it out and submit it to us, and we add it to our national database. We just want to know what you have, what kind of conditions it's in. We don't want to take it from you. We don't have money to help you, digitize it quite yet, but hopefully in the future, those materials, those resources will be available. But right now, we really just want to know what's out there.
Very good. All right, Christine, Eric, good luck with the project. You can hear UofL Today with Mark Hebert every Monday and Tuesday night at 6 right here on 93.9 The Ville, with repeats on Saturday and Sunday mornings, and also online podcast at SoundCloud.com. I'll see you Monday mornings on WHAS TV's Great Day Live with a new story about research students or something cool happening at the University of Louisville. Thanks for listening. Go Cards.